Hello, everybody. Thank you for joining us. We'll just give a few minutes for everybody to join. I hope everyone's having a great Wednesday and happy Women's Day. Perfect. Thank you everyone for joining us. We'll get started now, and this is being recorded for anybody that wants to join later on. So hello everyone, thank you for joining us today in our first Women's Day session. My name is Jenelle McCulloch. I'm a consultant at CSPN, and today we're joined by Judith Paterson to talk about equity and inclusion in organizations through a lens of community-based research. So an introduction to Judith. Judith is a registered social worker, psychotherapist, and workplace wellness advocate. Judith has completed an MSW, an MBA, a certificate in cognitive behavioral therapy, and is Lean Six Sigma Black Belt certified. Judith has over 25 years experience leading departments, projects, and grassroots business improvement groups in a wide range of industries, which include manufacturing, not-for-profit, third-party warehousing and logistics, and home healthcare. Judith now works in a private practice counseling people with workplace issues and consulting with businesses to improve workplace wellness and employee engagement. So Judith has a passion for social justice, community-based research and evaluation, and their unique application to business settings. If you want to learn more and want to reach out to Judith, she can be reached at her website at judithmsw.com. So Judith, I am very excited for our conversation today. One reason is because you have a wealth of experience from different industries and also methods of practice to draw from. For example, your background in Lean Six Sigma, which is really, that process-related improvement, but then in recent years, as we talked about, transitioning into the employee wellness space. And you mentioned a core pillar of that was, community-based research. So I want to start our conversation there. So could you tell me what is community-based research?
Sure. Thanks for having me. I'm excited to be here, and happy Women's Day to everybody. So community-based research is a type of research used mostly by social scientists, or typically used by social scientists. And the main feature of community-based research is that the community members, and so community members is the group that you're studying and could be applicable to a business or a department. Typically in social sciences, it could be a group of people, or it could be a city, that type of thing. The main feature is that the community members are part of the research team, and that makes all the difference. And we'll talk a little bit about how that makes all the difference, but that's the main feature, is that they are involved. Community members are equal members of the team. The research team themselves, or the researchers themselves, work more as facilitators. And the community members are involved right from the design through to the report creation and the suggestion development. And this allows for very deep understanding of the topic, getting to things that researchers don't typically get to in other ways. And it's an excellent way to ensure that the voices of communities and community members who don't tend to be heard are heard. It's really the best way to do that.
Mm-hmm. Perfect. And sorry to interrupt our conversation, but anybody, we do also have the chat. If there are any questions, we will also be taking questions. So definitely put any questions in the chat as well as we go along, and I will ask those as well. So thank you for that overview of community-based research. And it sounds like it's really, grassroots, which somewhat relates to Lean Six Sigma from my very vague knowledge of Lean Six Sigma as well, which you also have a background in. Do you see any connections? What connections do you see between those two modalities, community-based research and Lean Six Sigma?
And that was really struck me. And that's kind of where this all came from, looking at how to apply the types of social science types research to business problems, was there are so many similarities, striking similarities. So in Lean Six Sigma, and many people probably know about Lean Six Sigma, but it is a quality tool mostly often used for problem solving, to make things better, and often from a customer satisfaction lens. And of course, community-based research, action research, or evaluation is about making programs better, or solving community-based problems. And Lean Six Sigma also has that feature of involving a diverse group of people on the team. So it's team-based as opposed to individual-based problem solving. And it's the people with the lived experience that you want on that team. So the frontline workers. If you're doing something that involves customer service reps, you would have your customer service reps in there. You would be very careful that you've got a great cross section. So new employees, more seasoned employees, people from other departments, sometimes actually even customers. So you can use this for customer satisfaction surveys. You can have customers as a part of your research team. And so they're similar in that way. And both of them give a voice to people with lived experience. Both of them hopefully involve the community members in actually pulling the data, analyzing the data, coming up with the reports. And the one thing at the end of all of these Lean Six Sigma projects is that we often will ask people, what was the biggest thing you learned doing this? And it's generally how much better it is to have a group of people with different experiences coming together, how much better the solutions were. And how much better it is to have a group of people working. So very similar. They're actually very similar, slightly different, some slight differences, but both have that concept.
Yeah. Yeah. And I found that really interesting because you think of community-based research, then you think of something like Lean Six Sigma, and you feel that they come from different worlds. But at the core of it, as you said, is, going to the people who, is directly impacted by the work that you're doing, or the solutions that you want to make. So I found that really interesting about those two.
Yeah, and the one interesting thing that I found that's a difference that I don't think should be a difference is that in business settings, and often Lean Six Sigma is used for manufacturing lines, things like that, very quantitative based, so very numbers driven. And the community-based research tends to be the opposite. So there is some quantitative, but it focuses a lot on the qualitative, which is listening to people's stories and looking for themes there. And I really think there's a huge opportunity to take the qualitative that business people don't put as much stock in, and use that in a bigger way in business settings. And that's kind of the piece that I think we could learn the most from, is that those stories are so important, and there is a way to pull kind of data-driven information out of listening to stories.
Mm-hmm. No, I think that's really, because it really, that qualitative research gives you that context, right? There's only so much that you can receive from a data point, right?
Right.
In a number, right? Because there's people behind that data, and so you can get that from the qualitative.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Perfect. So going back to community-based research, why would you, a little bit more about why would you apply this type of research in organizations?
It gives you a depth of understanding that it's hard to get in any other way. And sometimes we don't know what we don't know. As leaders, we do assume that we understand all of the struggles that employees are having. We understand what the needs of the customers are. But every time you do this type of research or an evaluation, you learn things that you're really surprised that you would learn. Not only that, but it helps with the accuracy. So it gives you a much more diverse set of voices to hear stories from, and it helps with your accuracy in pulling that information. And for an example, and this is actually not from my experience, it's actually from a textbook, but there was a study done where a community wanted to make sure that young people, so youth, had access to good sexual health information, and they were going to open up some locations where youth could go in and have various questions and needs met. And they decided to do a community-based research on what were those needs and where should we put these clinics. And the researchers, the community-based youth that were part of the research team, as they were designing the survey they were going to send out, noticed that one of the questions was to ask for a postal code. And they all unanimously said, we will lie. We don't know any youth who we're just too worried that it's too identifying. It's a sensitive topic. If you ask that question, we're going to lie. And so they decided to only ask for the first 3 digits of the postal code, and they all agreed. And when they tested it with community members, they agreed they got the right information. So can you imagine if everyone had lied and they used that information to build physical clinics, how poorly that could have gone? So just those are the types of things that you can learn from having community members as a part of your team.
Mm-hmm. No, that's a really important point, because it's not only because we talk so much, you know, in these types of settings where we need to hear from the front line, we need to hear from the people, but it's really just to hear their opinions and to get their feedback, but rather this takes it a step further where it's incorporating them in the start of how to actually design and collect that right information.
Right from the design. Yeah.
Nuances. Perfect. No, that's super, super interesting. And so when applying this to organizations, do you have any examples or any kind of ways that this could be applied in organizations?
So it depends what you're looking for. So I would say if you're trying to solve a problem, or you're trying to evaluate something, or you want to know about employee satisfaction or customer satisfaction, then the number one thing would be to make sure that you've got a group of relevant community members on your team. So that's how you would start. And even be so bold as to have customers on your research team if you're doing a customer satisfaction. And so they would be there right from the get-go, right? They would help design the strategy. Are we doing a survey? Are we doing focus groups? Are we talking to individuals? And so that's the start. The second thing is to make sure you really understand what it is you're trying to do. So get a really good problem statement, perhaps, that outlines what is the question we're trying to answer. It can be really easy when you're doing qualitative and talking to people and listening to stories to kind of go down a rabbit hole. You will find other things that maybe you want to do other research on in the future, but it's great to really understand what question you're trying to answer and stay focused. And to look at surveys, for example, if you want to do a survey as a starting point. So also incorporate different types of data gathering. So focus groups, individual interviews, use different types of methods and don't just use one, I would say would be a good way. But really, on a smaller scale, you can be doing this for everything. So just thinking about that, I guess what we would call a nothing about us without us approach. So challenge yourself to include other people in the types of discussions and problem solving that you do on a daily basis where you don't tend to do that. For example, I was in so many meetings where people would say, let's talk about Bob. I wonder if Bob would be interested in a leadership role someday. And well, can we have that conversation with Bob in the room? And so many times, would our employees really like it? Do you think if we ordered in sweatshirts, or would they prefer thermoses, right, with our logo on it? Well, why don't we ask? We forget, right? We forget to do that. So just a challenge to have other people there when you're decision making and policy making and that type of thing. Is that helpful? Does that answer the question?
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, because just generally, I think you touched on how a little bit of how you would apply it and why it's important to apply it. One thing that it did spark my brain, because a lot of organizations have like employee resource groups. Do you have is there any ways that maybe employee resource group would be maybe a good way to incorporate into the community-based research, maybe within that design phase, or any experience with that?
So it depends who's on it and what you're using it for, but that's a great approach. Like I worked for a company that had a people development committee, but there were no people on it. It was all directors kind of and above, who felt that they were good representatives of what their employees needed. And they likely were in a lot of ways. But in private practice, my clients come to me with concerns about work that are really causing them a lot of trouble. And they're not things that they've ever shared with anybody in their workplace. And it's a shame that their employers don't know and that their managers don't know, because these are actually things that could be easily fixed if known. So in those types of committees, as long as we've got the right people, maybe we're rotating people in and out. They're not just people who have the time to do it. They are actually the right people to be talking to. And it's a safe environment to bring up difficult topics.
Mm-hmm.
I got to say, I don't know enough about it to really say whether it could replace. I don't think it could replace necessarily a group that's focused on one particular solution of a problem or understanding one particular thing. But it's certainly a great group to reach out to for feedback and even involve in the process in some way.
So would you recommend just thinking about, for example, I'm in an organization, I want to collect data, do some research on a specific topic. What would be my first step in kind of determining who I'm going to have on that team for the community-based research process? Like, how do I determine, who are the right people that I should be consulting with or bringing into the process?
So that's a good question. You could start by understanding the problem. What are we really looking for here? The what, why, who's, when's, all of those. And who does this touch? So maybe almost looking at who are the people who input something into this process or this problem, who are the people who get something out of this process or problem, and who are the people who the workers in this. And then I would actually pick from each of those groups so that you've got everybody involved. You don't have to have, if it's a long project, everybody involved in every single meeting, but you would want them involved in the strategies that you're using to solve the problem, what's the process you're using, what is the problem statement, what is it questions we're trying to answer, and basic strategies like that. But I would involve all the kind of the input people, the doing the work people, and the output people. Does that make sense?
Yeah, no,
And
that's
then within that, maybe even look at new employees, existing employees. Is there a way to break it down into groups that might be separate within groups? Leadership, frontline people.
Yeah. That's a really good framework to really start, right? Where you're thinking about who's being impacted, what are the inputs to the process. And then I guess you mentioned that next layer of when it comes to making sure that group is actually representative, if there is other kind of subgroups within there as well. So I guess you'd have to first also start with a strong understanding of who are the people that you're who's your target population, right? And if there's any specific nuances within those subgroups.
And you can ask. So once you get that group, ask them, who are we missing? Is there anybody not represented here that you think would be a good problem solver? Sometimes it surprises you, right?
Mm-hmm.
Sometimes there's a key person outside of a process that actually has a lot of insight. So good to ask, are we doing this right? Are we going in the right direction? Do we have the right people?
Mm-hmm. Definitely. I think this is a great conversation and introduction to the approach of community-based research, what it is and how it can then be applied to organizations. My next question, I'm curious of when inclusion, how does this tie into inclusion and equity?
So that's it doesn't guarantee equity. So just because you've got a diverse set of voices on a team, it doesn't automatically ensure that all your policies and practices in the workplace will be equitable. But it is an amazing step in the right direction. If you do have diverse voices, if you do have everybody represented when you're making policy changes or when you're solving problems, or just employee satisfaction type surveys, it certainly allows that to happen. So it is the starting point in listening to the voices and hearing the voices that can allow you to create an environment that is equitable. But it is not guaranteed, right? It doesn't automatically ensure equity, but it definitely makes it much more possible.
Mm-hmm.
Does that make sense?
Yep, definitely. When it comes to kind of that next step of ensuring equity, is there any, additional steps, or does that really come from after you understand like the outcomes of the research and then applying them, and then that's how we get to the equitable outcome? So
I think if we're listening to the voices, we should be getting more equitable. Of course, it depends what type of research you're doing. If you're setting out to be equitable, then you'd be asking questions and you would get feedback, and you should be able to apply things that help you move in that direction. But even if you're not, even if you're just trying to fix a problem on a manufacturing line, still having those voices, it's amazing what comes out of that. And just by the nature of asking opinions, you are making the workplace more equitable.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, it's applying the learnings, I guess, that you're getting. And it won't be perfect. You're not going to learn everything at once. And we do worry about that, right? How can I, if I'm just speaking to people, if I'm leaning more towards the qualitative, how could I possibly know everything? And you won't know everything, but you're just moving in the right direction and making things better as you move forward.
Mm-hmm. And sometimes I've heard this in my work when working with some leaders, and they kind of mention not wanting to ask certain questions or get certain feedback because of the fear that maybe they can't deliver on, what is asking. So how do you have any experience in balancing, from that leadership perspective of, what is realistic and can be done, and the employee perspective and what they're experiencing, and reconciling those two? Because sometimes there are some, constraints or barriers to be able to, make those improvements moving forward.
Yeah, and that's an incredibly common thing that I don't ask because I don't want to know. And that happens everywhere. That happens in private practice when people are concerned about their performance and they don't want to ask their manager for feedback because they're scared of what they'll hear, right down to I've heard presidents and owners of companies saying, I don't want to do a customer satisfaction survey because I'm scared of what I'm going to hear. But in all of those cases, I think we know, and the reason why we're probably all here is because we do believe that it's important to hear the difficult things. And like you said, one of the other issues is, okay, I want to hear the difficult things and I do want the feedback, but I'm worried that somebody is going to bring up, the suggestions are going to be things that I can't do. So what if all of the customers say, I need you to drop your price by 50%, right? That's a fear. We know it doesn't happen, right? Generally, they come up with things that we didn't know of that we can fix, and we're happy to know. But if that is the fear that your employees and the employee focus groups that you want to run or the research that you want to do are going to come up with a suggestion that you cannot implement, and then you're worried that you're going to make the whole thing worse. First is, I don't think there's any evidence that it would make the whole thing worse. I think as long as you're listening and you're providing feedback back about what you're doing that you've heard, here's what we're doing with the solutions, here's why we're not implementing that, and what we're going to do with this, that tends to always be positive. But one thing that people can do is put boundaries and parameters around their questions. So you could pull in some employees and say, want to know how we can make things better for you, how we can make this process more efficient, whatever your question is. Just know that at this time, we're not able to talk about salary, but we do want to know what are all the other things that we could do to be helpful, and we're not able to review that right now. So just know what the parameters are, right? So kind of put parameters around it and say, here's what we're looking at, and here are the things that are out of scope right now. And so here are the things that are in scope for this conversation.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, those are some really important points. One is, giving employees the autonomy from their own, like incorporating them again into that problem solving, right? Into that solution, saying, this is, the situation we're at, giving them transparency, giving them a little bit more power back in that, final decision making as well.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. It's almost about honesty, right? Isn't it? Just being very upfront and honest. Here's what we're trying to do. We're concerned about this. We want to ask you about this. Here are the things, though, that might come up that are unfortunately off the table at this point in time. So talk to me about that, right?
Yeah, I love that aspect of just being honest. And I guess it somewhat starts with, the leadership and the culture and the climate of the organization. So that was another thing I wanted to ask about is, how do you, foster those environments to make people comfortable to share, whether it's, sharing informally with their manager or their boss, or whether it's sharing within the research context, either one of those.
Yeah, so there are a few tactics for that. And we talked at the beginning how you're going to have community members or employees in this case, most likely, or maybe customers as a part of your research team. Mm-hmm. And you should actually have them, when possible, running any of these types of focus groups or individual conversations. So it goes right from they will be designing the questions. So they should be able to give input into what types of questions and what type of phrasing of these questions will make people most comfortable. They'll have some watchouts. And if they are doing, we have found that if they are actually doing the interviewing, we get a lot more feedback. And I was on an amazing project sponsored by, or I guess, it's the Syrian Youth Mentorship Initiative, which is run by the CMHA. And out of necessity, we had our Syrian youth researchers do the focus groups, because there were a number of people in the focus groups that only spoke Arabic, and none of the researchers spoke Arabic. And well, thank goodness, because it was amazing. Just the depth of the information that we got was so phenomenal from taking that type of an approach. And that at the same time, I was also running focus groups in a business setting on how to improve communication, and wishing we had done it that way. It would have turned out so much better if we had had team members run the focus groups. And to train people on running focus groups and the skills needed, again, there's that extra layer that everybody on the research team now develops new skills that they can take away and use for future problem solving projects as well. It's empowering, it's skill building, and you're getting great information. Some other tools of making people feel comfortable, I think, is not to require people to participate.
Yeah.
Some people just will never feel all that comfortable. And so I would never mandate people's participation. I think it's also really important to be upfront about confidentiality. So how will you keep this information confidential? And whether you will or you won't, explaining the use of it very carefully. Often it's really great when you publish results of these types of things to use direct quotes. So if you're going to do that, make sure you let people know that you're doing that. And another step would be to have them read the report. Community members, even everybody involved in the focus groups, if possible, read the reports to make sure, for a bunch of reasons, to make sure that you've captured it correctly, that your themes are the right themes, but also so that they can make sure they're comfortable with everybody reading what you've got in there. And one more tip, lots of tips, is to break the focus. If you're using focus groups, to break them out into manager groups and individual contributor groups, and even within that, maybe new employees, existing employees, just to pay attention to whether everyone in there will feel comfortable talking.
Because that was one question that I had, where the recommendation, if possible, to have, for example, employees running the employee focus groups, right? And so would you then how would you select which employees are running those focus groups so everybody feels comfortable? Because I would assume you wouldn't want a manager running a individual contributor focus group, so they might not feel comfortable sharing, right?
And that's actually what happens most of the time, or at least, you get an employee satisfaction survey back. It says, you didn't do well at this, never gives enough information to actually solve the problem. So then the manager pulls their employees into a room and says, can we talk about this? How can we make it better? And we do that a lot. And there's nothing wrong with managers pulling employees into a room to ask questions, but you probably will get better information if you do it in a slightly different way. And so it would generally be the people that you've chosen for your research team that would be running those focus groups, if they are comfortable. And it does involve, they're not going to magically be able to do it. It does involve giving quite a bit of training to make sure there's a comfort level and doing dry runs. Generally, you would have 2 people. So you wouldn't want to do it by yourself. You're going to have a note taker, you're going to have a speaker. There's much more comfort in that when you know that you're not by yourself, that you've got 2 people there. Other tips are to tape it. And so to get data, but again, make sure that if you're taping it, it's making it, people aren't uncomfortable, right? And of course, there should always be a guarantee that the second you've got your data out, it's deleted.
Yeah, definitely. No, I think those are all really, really great points in how to really involve and make sure there's that, safe space. One thing that does come in mind, and I'm not sure, perhaps you had different experiences with size of organization. So when it comes to doing this types of work in smaller organizations, groups become a lot more identifiable. Is there any, tactics or any approaches to help make people feel more comfortable sharing their stories, sharing their experiences when it's such a small organization?
Yeah, if it's a small organization or a small department, you are definitely going to know that this group, someone in this group of people made. So what we're doing is we're looking for themes. And so I guess it's important to make people, ensure that people recognize that it will be known that people who participated have brought these concerns forward, right? So they should always be aware that they're in these types of things, their confidentiality is protected to as much of a point as we can, but it's not guaranteed. And that's where you would allow people not to participate. Hopefully what we're doing is we're looking for themes that everybody's very happy to have and to identify and to work on. And so hopefully, hopefully there isn't information in there that's too detrimental, but always warning, right? Just warning people, not taking things for verbatim. And we're always looking for themes, right? Yeah. And that's really important when you're looking at being accurate, is to what they call titrate or triangulate, triangulate the data, which means that you're having several people look for those themes. So you're going to have 3 or more of your researchers go through the data. You're going to use various types of data. So surveys, historical data, interviews, storytelling, various different things, and you're going to look at themes across them, and it's going to be several people who are looking for these themes. And so when you do something like that, it becomes, very rarely would anything become identifiable of just one person.
Okay, that makes sense. Yeah, so making sure that you're, as you said, try aggregating the data in a way across different types of research as well. And then also, and I guess you mentioned this a little bit, of keeping, if this is a research project that individuals will, and say it's a small team and you're going to be, problem solving or ideating or a part of the solution afterwards, that it is, I guess there is that cultural climate of, psychological safety. There's that climate of, you can speak up, and there is that if you say something, you're not going to be reprimanded, or those types of things. And that culture is already existing, especially if it's a small team or a group.
Yeah, there is always that risk. So in, research done by universities, they always tell you the risk, right? And they're very explicit about what the risk could be to you in participation. I've not seen people do that really in a workplace. I don't know if there's a need to do that, but just be conscious of the fact that there are power differentials in businesses, and there could be issues with employees giving feedback about their manager, for example. So if you feel that there is that type of a situation, if that is where the information is going, we're talking about how our managers are, you know, causing issues, then I think it would be prudent to warn people, just that we're protecting your confidentiality. We are looking for themes only. But just know there is this might be upsetting to some people, and I just want to warn you about that. If you don't want to participate, then don't participate. It's very rare. I've not seen that happen, but it is something, at least for leaders, to recognize that there is a power differential there, and that can be fearful for some people. It can make them very fearful, I think.
Definitely. Perfect. I think we talked about a lot of really great tactics so far. Are there any other tactics that we haven't mentioned yet for organizations to leverage?
So I would say just take the time to do this type of thing. I know that it's really hard because we get caught up in the whirlwind of work and firefighting, and all of those types of things. So it becomes very difficult to reach out and ask questions, or to really try to solve a problem. Maybe you're looking at, why is our turnover so high? It seems very time consuming to get a focus group together to explore these types of things. So I think it's just remembering to pull yourself out of that whirlwind, and to try and reach out and get a good set of voices involved, because it makes everything better. It makes everything better, and it makes everything easier. I talked about power differentials. We don't realize that so much. I know leaders don't think of themselves as powerful, but in my private practice, that comes up almost with everybody. And so it is good to recognize that that you are seen as somebody who has a certain amount of power, and to consider that when you're reaching out for information from employees.
Mm-hmm.
I would challenge people to use that nothing about us without us rule in their day-to-day work. What other? I would say, don't get caught up in the qualitative versus quantitative. We talked about that a little already, but people are very hesitant to use stories and focus groups and that type of information. And it is really where the gold is. So don't not do your quantitative, your employee satisfaction surveys. In community-based research run by social scientists, they use that only as a starting point. That is how it begins and kicks off the research. So if you ask the right questions in the survey, that leads you into, what am I going to do with that now? And how do I actually dig into this and get the data? So don't shy away from conversations, and using that data as real data. I think just be careful. Sometimes people think that designing something or making a decision and then going out to the community, so the department or the workplace or the team, and saying, here's what we did, can you give us your feedback, is a type of community-based type research. And it is the opposite of community-based research. That is a very difficult thing for people. Don't like that. So you're not going to get the feedback that you're looking for. And it actually can rub people the wrong way, that this decision was made without them. Always better to start right from the get-go. Let's define the problem that we're trying to solve, and let's come up with a strategy to do that, including your community members, as opposed to saying, here's what we're thinking, what do you think? It's actually kind of the opposite of what we're trying to do. That's all I can think of
for the time.
Was that specific enough? Did that answer your question? Okay.
Yeah, definitely. No, it's been a wealth of information, everything from, the approach and the strategy and the philosophy behind community-based research to you provide us some really good tactics of what to do and what not to do in organizations and how you can bring along people within that process. I was wondering if there's any within your experience, any barriers or lessons learned that you can share.
I would say, I think I've talked about most of them already, but I would say one is just be wary of saying that you don't have the time to do it. And two, be careful that you're not sending the employees that have the time. So I've seen that. I've talked about a lot of other things, but I see that often, that we're going to do this. We're going to have this research team or this problem solving team. We've got these employees that don't have a lot going on right now. And so those are the ones that are going to go. It's always important to make sure that you're picking the right people and that you do get somebody from all those groups, the input groups, the process groups, the outcome groups, and not just the people who might have the time. If we can free up the time for the right employees, it's always going to be better.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and you say mention that it does take time to do this, and it takes resources to do this. And a part of it is it may feel like you're taking a step backwards in productivity, right? But that step backwards will lead for better results at the end. So how do you make kind of this business case to leaders or executives? Why should leaders care about taking this approach over, the former approach, as you said, of we'll make the decisions and get your feedback or tell you what to do?
Yeah, and that's hard. You can, of course, explain to, project sponsors or whoever you're explaining to that we want to be inclusive, we want to improve equity, and that we just know that this will give us a better solution. And hopefully, we're working with people who believe in that enough that that's a good enough explanation, but it isn't always. And so I would be very detailed about the proposed outcome. So about the problem that we're facing, whatever it is, clearly state it and put it in either productivity gains or hopefully monetary amount. So we have found that over the past 6 months, our turnover rate has increased by 10%. And that costs us this in recruiting, this in training. We've noticed that the mistakes with a higher level of new employees has gone from here to here, and how much it costs to fix that. And here's how much we feel we could improve that if we got to the solution of this problem. By asking people what's happening here and taking the time to do that. Does that answer your question? Turn it into, and sometimes that can take a lot of work and a lot of thinking, but turn it into, here's what we expect to get out of it. Here's the problem, and dollars and numbers, if possible.
Definitely. Yeah. So yeah, really understanding and drawing that connection between the employee experience and into the outcomes, right? And we know now with there's a wealth of employee experience related type research, like organizational research now, that really shows us that there is this huge connection between employee well-being and, specific business outcomes, like impacts on, everything from customer service to productivity, and however you measure those organizational outcomes or KPIs. So really making the connection between those two.
Yeah, so and you could definitely find that data. You could Google whatever data you're going to use. Data is just, if you have numbers in your presentation, it just makes such a difference, right? So all that information is available. Also, once you start doing these types of projects, you can refer back to them. So when we did it this way for this project, we improved things by 30%, that type of thing. But it's all about getting some type of numbers. So taking that, because we have this fear of storytelling, taking all of that type of thing and putting some type of numbers behind it.
Mm-hmm. Definitely. And I know when we were talking about this previously, and I think you also put it a lot more bluntly when I asked, why should leaders care? And you're like, it's the right thing to do. Simply just because it's the right thing to do. And I know in our Q&A here, I know there's a similar response, say leaders should care and be lenient to employees who have, for example, neurological issues such as epilepsy, productivity, and things like that. So and I think you've spoken to this a lot, is if you don't understand or care or take that extra step to understand your employee base and what their needs are, again, tying it back to the inclusion and the equity lens as well. So just around that is why I wanted to bring that up and incorporate this question that came in.
For sure. And so that's interesting you'd say that, and I wish I had the stats written down. Something like 15%, and don't quote me, of people in the workplace, it's probably not that number, but that's what I think I remember reading, have some type of neurodiversity. So autism, ADHD, other things. And how do you know that you're doing the right thing if you don't ask, right? And so I worked in a workplace where a new manager came in and told everybody in customer service that they were no longer allowed to wear earphones, and didn't like the idea of people listening to music. But there were some people in that office that wore the headphones and earphones for reasons other than listening to music, or that listening to music was the way that they stayed focused. And so it's an interesting thing, you don't know what you don't know.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And especially with, because I was listening to a podcast, and it was about that, and where it's a certain hertz that you listen to for people that I believe it's ADHD, and you'll listen to a specific hertz and it helps you focus. And so exactly as you said, if, leaders don't care about, finding out what those needs are, they may make a process change that they say, oh, this is, this will enhance our productivity, but that's not the same for everyone. What a specific work context or working style for one person may not work for the next person.
Yeah, and I think that's a really good point. I think that's kind of what it's all about, is that we are all very busy people. We only have our own experiences. And so, like, I have an example of, I don't take a bus. I drive to work, but yet during the pandemic, we had people who had to take the bus to work. And so hearing that voice of, this is frightening for us to take the bus to work, and was something that, sure, if I had sat down and thought about it, I probably could have come up with that, but it just didn't occur to me without hearing those types of things. So we only know what we know. And perhaps that manager thought, I can't focus when I listen to music. Then I don't want people doing it because they won't be focused, right? We only know our own experiences. Mm-hmm. And so it's really quite shocking when you do hear everybody's feedback and voice, things that you would have never thought of.
Definitely. And I like how you say that we only have our own experiences. We only know the realm of what we do every single day. And the point that you said that we're extremely busy humans and our brains naturally go to, these mental heuristics and schemas that we've already developed about the world, right? To rely back on. And sometimes we need that wake up call to snap us out of what we think is right, or what we think is, the experience of somebody else, because it's not.
Right, for sure.
We have about 5 minutes left. I do want to remind everybody, we are monitoring the chat and the Q&A as well. So please put in any of your questions into there. I do have one last question, just as our wrap up. So if there was one thing that organizations could start doing, it can be two things if you can't choose one. If there is one thing that organizations, like one small step or one starting point, what would you recommend?
So I'm going to say something really small. I would just ask and listen. And I know that seems like a small thing and we think we do it all the time, but I'm not sure that we do. So if I could say one thing, it would just be challenge yourself to ask in all decision making. Questions, problem solving, anything, is just reach out and ask. Does that answer your question, or were you expecting something more profound? It's a small thing, but I really think it's the beginning. Is just ask.
But I think it's also a great takeaway, as we mentioned, we're very busy people, and having that very simple, you can always just, every single time before you make a decision, before you want to change something, just ask. Keep in mind who that end user is, who is it that decision going to impact, and how can you incorporate them. I think that really does actually sum it up very simply.
Great, thank you.
Wonderful. So we're all finished for this conversation for today. Thank you so much, Judith. I hope everybody enjoyed the conversation. I did. Having a research background, it was great to be able to dive into those aspects of, community-based research and in all of your experiences. Really great conversation. So for everybody that's listening, our next session is Embracing Equity, keeping with our theme, and it will be at 1 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. My colleague Zahara will be hosting it, and it will be a conversation with Tara Wilson, who is COO and CDO, Chief Diversity Officer at Room Rails, and the conversation will be focused on diversity, equity, and inclusion, advocacy and its significance, enhancing self-confidence, navigating difficult conversations, and negotiation. So hopefully between both of these conversations, you have a little bit about, we talked about how do you incorporate those voices, how do you do it from that research-based perspective, and our next conversation will be really focusing on the self and how you can have those tools. So I don't see any more conversations in the chat. Thank you, everyone, for joining us today, and happy Women's Day.
Thanks for having me. It was fun. Thank you.
Oh, and also before we go, for anybody that is still on, how can people reach you and get in touch? Because you do have your private practice as well.
Yeah, if anyone wanted to reach out to me, you can reach me. Probably the easiest way is just judithmsw.com. or info@judithmsw.com. So I'd love to answer any questions. If anyone has questions, feel free to reach out.
Perfect. And we'll include your links and all of that stuff with the recording as well.
Great. Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Thank you.